So I'm going to read the last chapter where the mystery is solved.
Oh, no.
No. I want to thank Phil for having me, Phil and Marcia. I first met Marcia a few years ago in Redlands, actually. We were both the visiting writers for the University of Redlands Writer Series. And the poet there at the University of Redlands was introducing Marcia, and she said, "There's this wonderful poetry scene in Ventura," and I was like, "What?" and I live like 5 blocks from here, which is the real shame of it. But ever since then, I've had the pleasure of being able to go to several readings that Phil and Marcia have hosted, and I appreciate you guys letting me bring my fiction to it. So I am going to read something from toward the end of the novel. It doesn't give anything away, and in the weird process of writing a book, this was actually originally the first chapter, but it's a crime novel, and I was playing around with time and order and things like that, and I thought, no, you know what? Let's just make it chronological. It's easier to understand a mystery if it just happens in order. So this chapter ended up way in the back, but I want to tell just a little bit about this chapter and where the names come from. So Phil said that the woman who was murdered is named Wilma, and I work at Cal State Channel Islands, and as you guys know, it used to be the Camarillo State Mental Hospital. And several years ago, I was digging around the archives, which I do a lot. And the archives, I don't know if you guys know this, are actually in the old morgue. Because it's nice and cool. It's it's climate controlled, and so I found this memoir they call them Camisoles, by a woman named Wilma Wilson, and I read it, and it's a fascinating book. And the thing that they called camisoles were straitjackets, and that really lets you into the kind of approach that Wilma Wilson takes, which is that it's a very funny book that's also will break your heart on just about every page. And so when I was done reading it, I thought, well, what happened to Wilma? And I looked it up, like the real Wilma, not the Wilma in my book, and she was murdered. And she was murdered 1946, I believe it was. And what's that?
That's when I was born.
Maybe you're the reincarnation of her. Maybe. I'm not joking. But it was one of those, you guys have probably all heard of the Kitty Genovese case where a woman screamed that she was being stabbed. Well, before Kitty Genovese, there was Wilma Wilson, and she was in her bungalow in Santa Monica, and a guy came by her bungalow at about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, and she ran out screaming, and she's yelling and yelling for help, and no one came out and helped her, and he dragged her back in, and he murdered her. And so I thought, all right, I'm going to name the main character Wilma, and I'm going to make that the murder in my book, and then I'm going to have a different murderer because the real murderer was not interesting. The woman was... Yeah, that's the way it works. The interesting people get killed. So that was like the genesis of this book, and also, I mean, many years ago, this was the 90s, right around the time when some of the people in the back of the room were born. Hillary, no, I know. But in the 90s, I lived in Cocoa Beach, and I lived in one, which is in Florida, and I lived in an apartment that had a big courtyard, and there was always a woman who was in her 80s, and her name was Gertie, and she was always reading mystery novels, and so we would trade mystery novels, and I was always talking with her about it, and so I wanted to name a character after Gertie, and Gertie kind of took over the book a little bit. It's not really based on my old neighbor, but it kind of is. And so this is Gertie's chapter. I'm not giving anything away that's going to ruin the book, though I do give a couple things away. And so I'm going to read this section. And the book is historical. It takes place in 1943 and 1946. And this one is 1944. July 14th, 1944. Gertie noticed the cop as soon as he walked inside the joint. Tall and lean, ropey muscles under policeman blues, he reminded her of her brother-in-law, Jack, former brother-in-law. The cop couldn't have been more than a few months past his 20th birthday, but something about him looked older. It was in the eyes scanning the room. There was something serious about him, like he'd already been to Germany and back, or maybe he'd seen too much death here in Los Angeles. Gertie's dinner companion prattled on, something about a pair of shoes he'd seen Veronica Lake wearing on the lot the other day. If he'd been half as charming as he thought he was, she'd have listened. Instead, she watched the young cop. He caught her looking at him and headed straight for her. She took a quick mental inventory. What had she done that could lead to arrest? Well, this dinner date wasn't exactly on the up and up. It was all about selling a screenplay to this dandy. He was a novelist who'd lucked into a big money studio contract. The only problem was he had no idea how to write for pictures. He'd been assigned a crime movie, nothing special, just the usual corpse at the beginning and a pretty boy talking tough until he finds out who made the stiff. The dandy was a pretty boy, all right, but he couldn't fit in with the rest of it. He had no idea how to kill someone, in fiction or otherwise. And even if he did, he'd be more interested in solving the mystery of where the actress got her lovely pearls than of who committed this made-up murder. So the dandy did what so many other scribblers on the studio dole did. He hired Gertie to write his screenplay for him. It was her little cottage industry, all hush-hush, maybe a little fraudulent, but doubtfully illegal. Not the type of thing that inspires the law to crash Gertie's gimlet and cake. The scribbler's love life wasn't exactly legal in the state of California either, but he was here with Gertie, a woman, and there was nothing too obvious to suggest that they couldn't be a couple. Gertie nodded to the cop as he approached the table and tried to figure the angle. The cop said, "Gertrude Green?" Gertie saw no harm in admitting this. "We need you to come down to the coroner with us." "Us?" Gertie asked, because there's only one of them. "You're the only next of kin we can find," the cop said. He held out his hand. Gertie tossed back the rest of her gimlet. "Next of kin? Must be your mother." The scribbler stood. "I'll come along." Gertie shook her head. He already had a screenplay, she already had her money. She doubted she'd cry over her mother's body, but she didn't want to. And this dandy was so safe, such a doll, that his sympathetic eyes could turn on her waterworks. She ran a fork across the icing on her cake, licked the fork clean, said goodnight, and followed the cop out. The cop didn't say much on the drive down Sunset other than to answer how the next of kin had died. "Slipped in the tub," he said, "hit the edge face first. We suspect she was drinking." "I haven't seen my mother in so long," Gertie said. She counted the time in her head. She'd moved out when she was 16, which would make it, God, could it be 10 years? "I'm not even sure I'll recognize her," she said. The cop turned on the siren and gunned it. He weaved around cars, occasionally whipped into the opposite lane to pass, took turns sharp enough to tax the treads on his wartime retreads. Gertie couldn't see the angle in this either. Her mother wouldn't get any more dead. What was the point in racing? She wasn't sure if the cop was trying to impress her or scare her. He did neither. If he just wanted to shut her up, well, he did that. They charged through Silver Lake, Echo Park, Chinatown, and eventually over the bridge into Boyle Heights. And when they climbed out of the cruiser at the city morgue, Gertie forgot to breathe for a few seconds. It was strangely beautiful. A marine layer had settled in, making the moon less of a ball than a general glow in the sky. Fog glistened around the globes of electric light along the sidewalk. The building itself looked like a turn-of-the-century dance hall. Long granite steps, high windows with keystones over them, austere bricks, delicate stonework. A light was on in the attic. Gertie could see the wooden rafters through the window. Just above it, the morgue's own crown was a marble sculpture. It resembled a looking glass in a bed of flowers, like something from the Grimm brothers, maybe. The boy in blue tapped the small of Bertie's back and led her inside. He still had nothing to say. His silence was fine in the car, with city lights racing by and the bells of the inner urban cars ringing, and the drivers laying on horns to let the kid know that, police cruiser or not, this driving was not right. But here at the quiet morgue, with the ocean air seeping under her skin, Gertie needed a little dialogue, something to fill the empty spaces. As they crossed the marble foyer of the morgue and took the automatic elevator down to the basement, Gertie started chatting again. "I'm surprised you grabbed me instead of Wilma," she said. "She should be home." Because Gertie had insisted Wilma join her and her friend at Musso and Frank's. He was springing for dinner. He'd just as happily feed the both of them. But Wilma had worked a long shift that day. She said she was staying in, taking a bath, going to sleep early. "Wilma?" the cop said. He opened the elevator door. Gertie stepped out. "Wilma's my twin sister," Gertie said. "She lives in Highland Park. It's closer to here than Hollywood. You should have called her first. She has a phone and everything." The cop grunted. Wilma wound the film back a few frames and looked at it again. Maybe he hadn't added a question mark to the end of Wilma's name. Gertie stared down the dim hallway to the bright room a dozen steps away. She was here to ID her mother, right? Her mother was the drunk. Her mother was the one likely to slip in a tub and die. Her mother's death was the death that Gertie could handle. Her mother had never given much of a shit about Gertie or Wilma. Hadn't been to Wilma's wedding or the funeral for Wilma's husband. Hadn't gone with Gertie to visit Wilma in the mental hospital or helped out at all. Nothing, not a word for a decade. It was the mother under that sheet Gertie was rapidly approaching, wasn't it? Gertie wanted to ask the cop, but here they were already, turning into the bright room. Another flatfoot in a uniform stood by a corpse on a metal table. He was a short guy, maybe a hard heel over 5'2". His eyes had a way of looking at Gertie's direction and somehow not seeing her. The coroner, or at least a man in a white coat, sat behind a metal desk on the other side of the room. He was bent over, writing something on the paper in front of him. His bald spot sparkled under the overhead lights. Drawers lined the adjacent wall, a card catalog of corpses. Everything smelled like iron and antiseptic and blood. The cop led Gertie to the metal table. "Please tell us who you see under the sheet," he said. He nodded to his partner. The little flatfoot lifted the sheet. Gertie took a glance and gasped. She could have been looking at herself on that metal morgue table. That could have been her face with the broken nose and cold lips. It looked so much like her. Those same blue eyes and clusters of freckles and wild red hair. Gertie said, "Wilma?" The flatfoot whipped the sheet down. The cop turned to the coroner and said, "Gertrude Green has positively identified the deceased as her sister, one Wilma Green Chesley, of 243.5 Newland Street, Los Angeles, California." The coroner checked a box on his form. Gertie reached for the sheet again. The flatfoot held it down. "What happened to her neck?" Gertie asked. "Why was there blood pooled along her throat?" "She had a broken nose," the flatfoot said. "I know she had a broken nose," Gertie said. "I saw that. Why was her neck bruised?" The cop who'd led Gertie in grabbed her by the elbow and pulled her away from Wilma's body. "Come with me, Miss Green." Gertie yanked her arm out of the cop's hand. She grabbed the sheet over Wilma. The flatfoot pushed her. The cop wrapped his arms around her midsection and pulled. Gertie got just enough of the sheet so that she could see under it again. Deep bruises, like a sunset spreading from purple to red to yellow, lay across Wilma's throat. The cop lifted Gertie and turned her away from the table. Gertie held onto the white sheet. The flatfoot pulled it from his end. The cop started to carry Gertie away. She let go of the sheet. All right, she screamed. Her legs grew wobbly. She could have hit that polished vinyl floor if the cop hadn't held her in his arms. All right. Sobs started flooding out of her now. "Give me a break." The coroner hopped to his feet. He rolled his desk chair over to Gertie. The cop set her down on it. Gertie let the tears flow as they would. The coroner and the cop rolled her into the dim hallway. "It's okay," the coroner said. He reached behind his white coat and pulled out a handkerchief and handed it to Gertie. Gertie blotted her eyes. A thick streak of black mascara blackened the cloth. The coroner knelt in front of her. "You lost your sister. It's okay to cry. Take your time." Gertie nodded. She closed her eyes to squeeze the tears out, and when she did, she saw the bruises on Wilma's neck. As much as everything seemed to be falling apart around her, she was smart enough to keep from saying what she wanted to say more than anything. That Gertie didn't die by falling in a goddamn tub. Wilma had been murdered, choked to death, and Gertie knew exactly who did it. Thanks.
And yes, we are going to take a little open mic break.